an independent geopolitical risk consultant. I work with private businesses operating in complex security and business environments and helping them navigate those environments for successful business operations. I'm joined today by a wonderful panel. Let's go from left to right. They'll introduce themselves and then we'll get started.
My name is Rasha Elass, and I covered the war in Syria for Reuters for a couple of years, and I'm now repatriating to Washington, D.C., but I've spent the past 10 years in the Middle East covering it in different capacities.
Sounds good. And good evening, everybody. My name is Ahmed Ali. I'm a senior fellow at the Education for Peace in Iraq Center, and I don't do Syria, I only do Iraq.
Good evening, I'm Doug Ollivant. I'm a managing partner at Mantis International. We do work for both corporate and commercial and sovereign clients in southern Iraq, Baghdad to Basra. I'm also a senior fellow, the ASU senior fellow in the Future of War project at New America. I spent a long time in the military and government. My last job in government was director for Iraq at the National Security Council.
Wonderful. We are all on Twitter tonight with our names as our hashtags, except for Ahmed Ali, your Iraq Shamel. Yes, at Iraq Shamel. And we have a hashtag. We're going to do PS21 Mideast as our hashtag. So if you'd like to submit questions via Twitter, we'll keep an eye on that for you. There will be time for questions at the end. But first, I'd like to pose a question to all of you. How many of you think that ISIS is winning in its war? Raise your hands. Winning? If it's winning, raise your hands. Not very many. Okay, that's a good place to get started. Is ISIS winning? Let's have Doug start us off.
No, ISIS is not winning. ISIS is losing, and in fact, it's losing decisively in Iraq. Now, Syria is an entire different ball of wax. Its increasing number of affiliates are troubling, but it's on a path to losing in Iraq. And when it loses large portions of Iraq, it'll be very, very difficult then for it to keep its narrative up.
So what sort of timeline are we looking at?
1 to 2 years.
1 to 2 years.
In Iraq.
In Iraq.
So then another, gosh only knows how long for Syria.
Okay.
Well, it's a good question, and I'm delighted to be with you all today. I think when I look at ISIS, particularly in Iraq, you cannot look at what has happened in Ramadi and think that's the defining episode and the defining moment for the war against ISIS. This is a long-term battle. It started, in fact, officially in 2012 against ISIS. That's when ISIS was making a comeback in Iraq. And as a result, it only picked up, in 2014. That's when the ground battle has started. And if you look at that period of time, clearly, June 2014 to about August 15 of last year was a terrible period for Iraq, because ISIS was able to make a lot of advances, was able to take control of many cities. But since then, you have noticed a change in the dynamic in the war against ISIS, which has led to ISIS being on the defense. It had all the momentum that it needed back then throughout the country. Now it only has the momentum in Western Iraq. In Northern Iraq, we see that the Iraq Kurdish Peshmerga have done a good job containing ISIS. ISIS was kicked out decisively from Salahuddin province, not only from Tikrit, which is in the capital of Salahuddin, but the whole, almost the whole province. And that was it was not an easy operation. It required a lot of effort and coordination between different forces. And of course, even if you look at a place called Diyala in northeastern Iraq, ISIS was also cleared from that area. So it certainly is a mixed picture in Iraq. The only place where ISIS has shifted its resources, and I wrote about this. I'm gonna do the shameless plug-in.
Sure, go ahead.
Doug, I wrote about this in the New York Times, last Friday, and what I say is that what ISIS did in Ramadi and the effort that it decided to shift to Ramadi and to Anbar was the result of a recognition that it was on the defense and it was losing in other parts of the country. And for ISIS as an organization, it cannot be seen as a losing organization. It has to be seen as an organization that's on the march. At the moment, it is not on the march. Despite the fall of Ramadi, it's still contained, and you have to look at the decisive factors that have led to this outcome. and those include the forces fighting ISIS, because there are actually capable forces fighting ISIS on the ground. If you look at the numbers, we're talking about at least 200,000 anti-ISIS members, and many of them have shown great will to fight, despite what our Secretary of Defense has said, and that's a successful effort. But we do have to understand that this is a long-term battle, and it will keep changing back and forth. I'm more confident about what will happen to ISIS in Iraq in terms of being rolled back than I am with Syria. And with that,
So please tell us about Syria.
Well, yeah, and that's very unfortunate. ISIS in Syria is not losing. It's winning. It's controlling maybe over 50% of the country. But I think it's really dangerous to underestimate ISIS, even when it appears like it's being rolled back or it loses the city here or whatnot, because it thrives on that. And I remember a time in Syria before ISIS was a topic of discussion, and this was not very long ago, actually. Many in Syria, including the rebels, including Jabhat al-Nusra, no one took ISIS seriously. Everyone said, oh yeah, no, ISIS, no way, they can't take hold in a place like Syria. There's no bread for them, which is an Arabic saying, which means that they can't really thrive in Syria because they rely so much on foreign jihadists. They rely on an ideology that may not sit well with many Syrians. But as we've seen, it rolls. They do very well in a place like Syria, even with a lot of local suspicion, even with rebels fighting them, and now more recently, even with the Assad regime fighting them. So we can look outside of Syria, and I'm not going to touch Iraq, but for example, Libya, ISIS has a small presence there, but it's growing slowly, and it's also being underestimated by Europe, for example, which is suffering from the human trafficking of people across the Mediterranean, which, by the way, ISIS keeps saying, oh, we're planting sleeper cells among these, migrants.
To that point, I believe there was a report recently that one of the Tunisian museum bombers had come over on a boat and was, I think, in Sicily, I believe. There was a report of that. So do you buy into that? Do you think that those sleeper agents are moving into Europe?
ISIS claims that they put hundreds of sleeper agents on these boats. It's maybe difficult to believe that they put hundreds, but really all they need is a dozen or 2 dozen to wreak havoc in Europe. And so same thing, I think, I'm a newcomer to Washington. I'm finding among the intelligence community and Washington insiders, a lot of people don't seem to take the ISIS threat as an immediate threat. A lot of people say, oh, Al-Qaeda is our immediate threat. It's not ISIS. ISIS maybe in 2 years, but right now it's really Al-Qaeda that we still need to worry about. I'm not so sure. I mean, I've heard it before, and I've seen how ISIS takes advantage of this.
Okay, well, if we say that ISIS is losing in Iraq and winning in Syria, what do you all see as the strategy going forward for the United States and Europe in rolling back ISIS's progress in Syria and maintaining the momentum that it's gained in Iraq? I'll open it up. We don't have to go in order.
I mean, look, it's very clear we have an Iraq first strategy.
Mm-hmm.
We have an Iraq first strategy for 2 reasons. One, we have an Iraq first strategy in a positive sense because, as my friend was pointing out, there are a lot of partner forces in Iraq that we can rely on to do the heavy lifting. There are the official Iraqi security forces, the army, the police, there are the Shia militias, there's the Peshmerga, there are some Sunni tribesmen. There are all kinds of people in Iraq that we can work with who are extremely motivated to help us fight against ISIS, ISIL, Daesh, Islamic State, whichever you prefer. So that's the positive reason we're doing Iraq first. The negative reason we're doing Iraq first is exactly the flip side of that. In Syria, we have somewhere in the neighborhood of nobody who is willing to be a partner for us to help us fight against ISIL. And even to the extent that we try to generate forces to help us fight ISIL. It turns out they are far more interested in fighting against the regime than they are about fighting against ISIL. This is part of the problem with our putting together this entire coalition, is with the notable exception of the United States and Baghdad, everyone who is in the coalition is interested in fighting ISIS, but it's no less than their number 2 priority.
How do we change that?
These are
Or what do we expect to happen to change that?
nothing's going to happen to change that. There's nothing that is going to make the Turks, for example, care more about ISIL than they do about the Assad regime and about their own internal Kurdish problem. The best is like looking at the 2 major protagonists in the region, the Saudis and the Iranians. Do the Saudis hate ISIL? Yeah, they do. Do the Iranians hate ISIL? Yes, they do. Do the Saudis hate ISIL worse than they hate the Iranians? No. Do the Iranians hate ISIL worse than they hate the Saudis? No. It is a second-tier problem for almost everyone else in the region, again, with the notable exception of us and the Iraqis themselves. And even likewise with the Assad regime. The Assad regime does care about fighting ISIL, but it cares far more about fighting the Free Syrian Army and the Nusra, which it sees, rightly, as more immediate threats to its continued existence. So Syria is just so hard, and of course, this administration has put certain red lines in place on Syria that politically it just can't move off of, and I think it's clear that well, part of the Iraq First strategy really is about the conditions are right in Iraq, and they're not right in Syria. A second piece of this is we just have to punt this to the next administration because we can't deal with Syria.
Okay.
Yeah, look, the United States is a crucial player in the fight against ISIS. You do have a 60-member, anti-ISIS coalition, but the United States remains the most committed, that's for sure, and the most able to devote a whole lot of resources, the most knowledgeable country about Iraq to an extent. Doug, I know it's not complete, it's not 100%, but we do have the institutional members here in the United States, and there is a legacy that we have in Iraq that as a U.S. government we're trying to solve it. So that's the approach. It will be a big mistake for a lot of folks to underestimate ISIS because that's when I was talking about the ISIS threat back in April of 2013, everybody thought I'm crazy. So I wouldn't underestimate it at the moment, but at the same time, we shouldn't think of ISIS as 10 feet tall. And I think for the administration, it has to begin, from that orientation, that this is still a dangerous organization. Ideologically, it's very serious. And the way it was explained to me by people fighting it on the ground is that it does it by the letter. It implements its ideology by the letter. So we have to understand this threat. The U.S. is capable of doing a great deal to defeat ISIS in Iraq in particular. One major line of effort is the airstrikes, and I think those when the U.S. has decided to deploy them effectively and widely, they have made a huge difference on the battlefield. If you look at Kobani, ISIS made it a priority. It became a priority for the United States as well, and the U.S. and the YPG and the Syrian Kurds, came on top. Same thing with Tikrit, same thing with other areas. So you have to look at the airstrikes. They have to be expanded. There has to be, clearly, expedited delivery of weapons to the Iraqis, because with the fall of Ramadi, one of the deficiencies that was pretty apparent was the Iraqi forces did not have anti-tank missiles, anti-tank, weapons, which could have been very effective to deal with the, 27 to 30 car bombs, armored car bombs that ISIS sent, and they, spread. They demoralize the security forces. So we have to focus on that effort, and we also have to think about the best way to deploy U.S. troops. I don't think it should be 5,000 to 10,000. That would be a strategic error on our part, but we have to be open to modify our strategy, because as Rasha said, ISIS is an adaptive group, and we have to be adaptive as well. We can't stick to the same strategy as the situation unfolds.
So what strategy should the U.S. and Europe pursue with regards to Syria then, if they find themselves with few partners willing to engage in the fight?
Well, it's sort of like the ongoing war on terrorism, the ongoing war on drugs or poverty. I mean, you can't fight a war like this using just one strategy. And in this case, I think with ISIS in Syria anyway, you're right. There are no partners to work with, or there are no trustworthy long-term, sustainably long-term partners to work with, because a lot of them do switch alliances depending on who their priority is. There's also, not to be forgotten, the war, the fight for heart and mind in, winning hearts and minds in Syria hasn't worked very well for America lately. I mean, most Syrians wouldn't trust America. Many rebel factions think that ISIS is actually part of some conspiracy. They hear things like, oh, well, the West is happy that ISIS is fighting here because it attracts all their jihadists, and they figure, oh, the jihadists will go to Syria and get killed and never come back to America or Europe. So that's a good way to get rid of them. And by the way, I have heard this from people inside the intelligence community here in Washington who actually do count on that, thinking, oh yeah, well, these jihadists will probably get killed there, so we don't have to worry about them. So bombing ISIS, while I'm sure is important in rolling back some of their territory, can't possibly be the only solution in Syria. There has to be a more comprehensive solution. ISIS thrives on chaos. It thrives on a power vacuum. And as long as the country is deep in civil war, ISIS will continue to thrive. There are partners that I think Washington can engage to sort of curb the spread of ISIS, or curb ISIS inside Syria, and those partners may be controversial, but Iran and Russia are definite partners in this. They have to be engaged just as much as Saudi Arabia and Turkey, and without just a full engagement, full diplomatic engagement to resolve this, in addition perhaps to some military prowess, there's just ISIS will continue to run amok.
Let me follow up very quickly on one point, because this is, I think, a positive thing that we can take a little bit of solace in. ISIL thrives under a very specific set of conditions. Mm-hmm. It thrives in Sunni Arab regions in which state institutions are weak or non-existent.
So there's a limit to their spread.
When they run up against a place in which these conditions don't hold, when they bump up against Sunni Arabs in the south of Iraq, or bump up against the Kurds in the northwest, or bump against the Turks in the north, or again, the Kurds in Syria, or kind of hit the functioning states, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, sure. They don't spread. Now, of course, the bad news is this describes a whole lot of the region, and we see that, so you have these conditions in places in Egypt where they're popping up, in Libya where they're popping up, in the southern part of Tunisia where we've seen. So there are lots of places that fit these conditions where they can pop up, but there does seem to be a limit to their spread.
That is, in fact, a good thing. So I'd like to divide the question. There's the sense that ISIS is or isn't winning militarily, and there's a sort of consensus among most people that they're winning the PR war. Now, just in our audience, how many people here think that ISIS is winning the PR war? Quite a few more than think are winning the military war. Now, do you agree? And why do you think that is? And is there a sort of point at which their brutality starts to turn people away from them and helps them sort of lose that war in the PR sense?
Let me go first. I think the issue with ISIS being superior in the PR field is that a lot of people, I think the conclusion from the ISIS coverage is that a lot of people fall in love with bad guys. It's as simple as that, and we tend to lionize their gains and demonize the gains of the anti-ISIS forces and minimize the gains of the anti-ISIS forces. And you do have to look at And as a result, you not only have people who are ISIS adherents tweeting and propagating ISIS message on social media, but you even have some folks who are analysts or just not non-ISIS supporters who do the same thing because it looks good, and that's why I think particularly the social media war is very crucial to beat ISIS, because ISIS has had a hashtag going for almost a year now. That's called the Great Battle of Baghdad, Ma'arakat Baghdad al-Kubra in Arabic, and it gets shared. And if the way ISIS spreads its news, and I'm sure the case the same is in Syria, because I know it is in Iraq. Whenever there's an attack on an area, you see a whole number of accounts tweeting almost the same thing, and it gets propagated and it gets a lot of replay. So it's an issue that ISIS can do because it has the capability, and the other governments do not have the same agility. That's for sure, which makes it a big challenge. And that's why I think if we talk about the military campaign, there has to be clearly a counter propaganda campaign by the anti-ISIS forces, and I'm not going to say it is going to be 100% successful. I'm less confident about it compared to the military sense, but it has to be part of the thinking.
And do you think that level of brutality as it increases is going to dissuade people, or they'll just continue liking the bad guys, like you said?
No, I think people, all of these brutal videos and photos that ISIS broadcast tend to do one thing to different groups. It does inspire supporters, and it does intimidate opponents. I can tell you, when ISIS was getting close to reveal in August of 2014, I remember somebody told me, my teenage daughter came to me, and she said that ISIS is getting close, and I've seen what it does on YouTube and Twitter, and I'm very afraid. So what should I do? We're talking about a teenage person here. So it does have that purpose. So I don't think, and in the Middle East in particular, people are not as squeamish about violence as we are here in the United States. But it's not about the social media. It's about on the ground. The brutality will go against ISIS on the ground. But at the moment, we see that ISIS does commit a brutal act. If somebody objects to it, there's even a more brutal act to come after it. So the brutality has been a strong weapon in ISIS hands.
Do either of you have any thoughts on the issue of brutality and the PR war?
Yeah, well, I have to say, I don't think they're necessarily winning the PR war. I mean, I think anyone, now we have social media, but brutality is nothing new to humankind. And we have all the time there, I don't know, animal abusers, KKK, whatever, neo-Nazis in Europe that try to increase their platform online, and then they're suppressed. They don't have the money that comes to ISIS. They don't have any petrodollars that helped bring them to give birth to them. Basically, they don't have the weaponry, they don't have the clout, they don't have the scariness. So no, they're not necessarily winning the PR war. They've just gotten a lot of money and a lot of visibility for now.
I think they've also been very clever in the way they've approached a lot of these accounts. A lot of the more prominent ones,
Sean Witness?
Yes, the very famous, very pro-ISIL account, but it was only about 30-40% pro-ISIS and was 60% anti-Iranian. So would get a lot of pickup by the anti-Iranian, lobby analysts, et cetera, in Washington, in London, in Europe, in Israel, and they would kind of ignore the 30-40% that glorified violence against all kinds of people, and instead focused on the fact that this account was a relatively good source of news on highlighting Iranian misdeeds. So they're extremely clever in finding ways to infiltrate certain communities and other ways, embedding themselves in these larger contexts. And given how dominated the world has been by P5+1 over the last year, being anti-Iranian has been a really interesting way to infiltrate some media streams.
Also, if I can interject, they're very tech savvy, because they recruit a lot of nerds, and a lot of the Twitter accounts are actually echo accounts, and they've managed to program a lot of the,
Right. So their production values are extremely good. I was featured in the first issue of the Beat magazine, their English
We have a
language.
star among us.
Their English language propaganda magazine. I give people at the think tanks of businesses I work at a hard time because I'm like, this is the best layout on me that's ever been done. The production values are superior to anything that's done here in Washington, or they're very good. They have extremely high technical skill, and it's in a technical sense, it's quite admirable.
So now we're relying on private companies like YouTube and Twitter to go ahead and shut them down, and that's not really working very much, is it? So how do we share a different message? How do we prevent the radicalization that they're achieving through these savvy campaigns, if it has to be a two-pronged approach both on the battlefield and in the PR world?
Yeah, I do believe it's difficult, and that's why I said I'm less confident about this field, because it's it's easy to use. You can do it from your basement. You can do it in your pajamas, and
there's nothing to stop them from creating their own social network.
Absolutely, and ISIS has done that, because with different crackdowns, ISIS resorted to other means. At some point, they started using Russian servers and Russian websites, not English websites. But that doesn't mean, I think, particularly for us in the U.S., because we do have the capacity, and Twitter goes on suspension binges every once in a while, and it shuts down thousands of ISIS accounts. And that's a good thing, as long as you keep them under pressure. Though those users who are sympathizers with ISIS, you can do something. And there are actually some interesting folks doing trying to manage the social media presence for ISIS against ISIS. Fran Townsend, former national security advisor, she has an outfit in New York, and they're trying to do that work. So there has to be a systematic effort, but I don't anticipate it to be.
I think it's very difficult. There is no one profile of someone who joins ISIL. It's a very, very broad spectrum. But in general, there are two large pools. In the West, it's mostly teen angst. Kids who would otherwise join the goth movement or run off to California and join some wacko sex or drug based cult. So that's one strand. They're always going to be looking for something, that demographic. So it's hard to see them not finding a way to link themselves with a movement like ISIL. And of course, their other pool is one that, from a rational perspective, is quite logical. Young men in the Arab world who are not just unemployed but unemployable, no possibility of ever joining society, having family, will never be able to accumulate money for a dowry so they can have wife and children. You come find someone who has no future, no prospects at 15 or 16, and you hand them a gun and a sense of belonging and a way to have access to money and goods and sex. What 16-year-old is not going to sign up for that? And let the ideology come later.
And glory.
And glory, a sense of belonging, a sense of purpose.
Right, but they're not just looking for disillusioned people who are unemployed, right? They're looking for people who can get into the United States and into Europe and have the savvy to blend in.
No, there are lots. I mean, these are two pools. There are lots of others from which they also draw.
Yeah, but I think for the foreign fighters, I see what Doug is saying, is that it is about the disillusion, and the idea that if you come and join ISIS, you find a purpose is attractive to many folks who have difficulties assimilating in the UK, in France, or other countries. Some have even tried in the US, but as we know, we have the integration here and assimilation is easier for Americans who are born here, but not necessarily indigenous to the country. So it is about that pool, and I think particularly you have we have to be realistic. There is an issue with different Muslim communities around the world, especially those in Europe, even here in the United States. And that's why I do believe one way to do it is the parents. I don't want to sound like a school teacher, but I do believe the parents will have to play a big role. And we know, particularly for Middle Eastern families or just Muslim families in general, the family structure is much tighter and more strict. I can tell you from experience, with my parents. So there has to be, I think, a better understanding by the parents as well, better education by the parents.
Yeah, and I don't think that it stops there. I don't think the real question is how to stop them recruiting online or how to stop them putting out their ideology online and all that, because that's just unstoppable. And I don't think it's even a good idea to attempt to push them underground and push them off of Twitter and off of Facebook. No, actually encourage them to stay on Twitter and Facebook. That's an old strategy. Just encourage them to come to the surface. That way it's easier to keep an eye on them. It's easier to keep an eye on who's interested in following them and who's interested in going there. The real challenge comes when the authorities, the communities, the countries involved, the family structure get involved in stopping the flow of jihadists. And this is a global effort. I mean, Turkey, for one, can be stricter about monitoring its border and the flow of jihadists and weapons and money and whatnot. Europe can be stricter about making sure that jihadists don't travel to go there, and forget this idea that, oh, well, let them go because they'll just get killed and we won't have to worry about them anymore. Tunisia, which has now become a major partner with Washington, can do a lot more about exporting jihadists. Tunisia actually exports the largest number of foreign jihadists to ISIS. They can do more, and not stopping that. So, that's where the challenge lies.
So what I'm hearing from most of you is that it's not just enough to tackle ISIS on the battlefield and in a PR effort. You're saying that there are underlying issues in each of these countries that have to be targeted in some way to prevent these unemployed youths from feeling like they have no future and joining this radical movement. Now, how do we go about doing that? It's much easier to, deploy a force of American troops somewhere than it is to help these countries fix decades of abuse and mismanagement and poor government institutions.
Yeah, well, first of all, deploying American troops would be a bad idea. But I take your point. The immediate fight against ISIL is, a necessary step, but that's probably the easiest to handle, particularly in Iraq.
Right.
So, yes, we need to throw ISIL out of Iraq. We also need to make sure that there is a stable Iraq that's left behind that can handle the reconstruction, the reassimilation. We also need to ensure that Iraq is oriented more towards the West from a U.S. perspective and less towards Iran. Let me finish really quick. And then we need to figure out something about the Syrian civil war, figure out how we do something about this. And then in a much broader sense, we need to figure out how do you create legitimate paths for the Arab youth pulse to have both political and economic participation. Now, if I knew how to solve these, I'd get the Nobel Peace Prize. But those are the things that we have to do. This is a large regional crisis that is expressing itself in ISIL. Now, ISIL burns peoples alive and they run slave markets. So, they just need killing, and I'm okay with that. But that doesn't mean that there aren't, root causes that we don't need to be addressing simultaneously. But we need to be under no illusion about the speed by which these root causes, these are decade-long projects we're talking about to remove the root causes, that have created the milieu in which ISIL has been able to rise to the surface.
So with regard to Iraq, which is your specialty, you anticipate Iraq staying one country?
Yes. The alternative is a civil war that would make Syria look relatively calm. It's really, you can draw lines on the map and do your own Biden plan, but then you notice these lines go right through Baghdad. What happens to the 1 million, 1.5 million Sunni who live in Baghdad? Will that be peaceful? Suspect not. What happens to the entire province of Diyala, which is a mixing bowl of Sunni and Shia and Kurds? What happens there? You know, it's really easy to say, let's just split the country into three. The humanitarian cost of that would be very, very high. Further, let's look at the political cost. You know, much as Kurds like to talk about an independent Kurdistan, it's not a viable entity. We can talk about that later if you want. The history of landlocked states is not a really pretty one. You know, Sunnistan, as it's called, would become essentially an Arab Waziristan, Fatah, you know, no resources, no access to the sea, no particular reason for existence, as a political entity, you know, would just sit there. And then while Shiistan would then get much exponentially richer because they have all the resources, then they really would, they would lack the larger population that allows them to stand up to Iranian influence. And I think they would then become the Iranian proxy they're currently falsely accused of being.
You know, I'm not a betting man, because you know, I don't bet on something I don't control. But on this one, I'm willing to bet Iraq is going to remain united. I have no doubts in my mind, and it's not because Iraqis like to get along. It's because Iraqis need to get along, and they do know it. As much as you see discussion and, you know, a lot of heated debates and violence, political violence, there's still this understanding that the country, you know, is oil dependent, and the oil is mostly in southern Iraq, as Doug here pointed out, and as a result, it will be difficult, you know, for the other parts to you know, to leave Iraq that easily. Plus, today's Middle East is not the 1920s Middle East. You know, the British and the French, with all due respect to them, you know, they're not there to say, okay, this is Iraq, this is this part is this and this part is that. You know, this is different Middle East, and it's not easy to combine countries. ISIS is doing it at the moment, but that doesn't mean that it has been able to be successful. Clearly, what does have to happen, however, to continue to give everybody an incentive and to, you know, capitalize on their need is further decentralization by the Iraq government. And I think Syria is already actually going towards that way. You know, maybe unintentionally by Bashar al-Assad just, you know, giving some parts to, you know, giving up on some parts. But there has to be further decentralization. I think that's the right thing to do. Relations between Baghdad and Erbil have to they'll always be tense, but they have to improve as well. And especially, you know, as this fight against ISIS goes on, the Iraqis have to keep realizing that this is a common threat, because to be very blunt, up until May 17th, when Ramadi fell, Iraqis stopped believing that this was a common threat. They had moved on, and it was an understanding that this is a reality, and, you know, we have to deal with it somehow. But now with Ramadi falling, in fact, you know, it's a wake-up call for all Iraqis, and it has been in some ways good, and in other ways not very positive.
What about Syria? Where do we see Syria going?
You know, there was a time, maybe a couple of years ago, when it was feasible to think that Syria might divide into two, one sort of rebel-controlled and then the regime-controlled, going from Damascus, Homs, and the coastal provinces, and even regime insiders, people who are close to Assad, conceded this and said, well, in the end, you know, if that's what it comes down to, we'll never give up Damascus, Homs, and certainly never, ever, ever give up the Syrian coastline. And if they want Aleppo and the rest of the country, well, they can have it. But now I think it's a lot more complicated than that with ISIS. Decentralized is, you know, an understatement. It's not really clear. I mean, for the country to split, it needs to have, you know, at least two internally coherent but separate sections that can somehow go their separate ways and split up. But that's just no longer the case. There are many, many, many different parts of Syria that are incoherent within their own territory. So split, I think, if it splits, it would look something like polka dots. You know, it's certainly not two states or three states. So So in that regard, it's unified and it's decentralization, if that makes any sense.
Can I ask a question from Russia? Because, Doug mentioned it at the beginning, and you just brought up the fact that ISIS has changed the equation for the Syrian government. The Syrian government has chosen not to engage ISIS for a very long time, and that seems to continue to be the case. So why is the government calculating that?
Well, as with most things that the Assad regime does, it's not always easy to figure out what they're thinking, but certainly they were thinking, their priority was the rebels, and they figured, oh, well, ISIS, we can always rein it in, we can always bring it under control, it's not a real threat to us, not yet anyway. Let's just leverage the ISIS brutality, which is often directed against Syrian rebel groups. Let's leverage that. Let's have them, kill the rebels, take over this territory, and then we'll take the territory from ISIS when the time comes. I think it's a strategy that has already gone out of control for them. I don't know the extent to which they realize that. It's always difficult to read, but it's also important to realize that to a great extent, Iran runs the show now in government-controlled Syria. So it's no longer really necessarily Assad's call; it's Iran's call.
We had a question come up earlier about the radicalization of Kurds. So Doug has dismissed the possibility of Kurdistan emerging independent. How do we see the Kurdish autonomous region being a major player in this situation? Do we see people?
Syria or in Iraq? Because there's one in Syria.
Let's go with Iraq for you, and then we'll talk about Syria.
That sounds good to me. I think Iraq Kurdistan is a fact. It is a secure area. When I go there, I stay out very late to the dismay of many people, including my parents. But the situation there, ISIS clearly still wants to destabilize Iraq Kurdistan, and that's why
a major accomplishment.
Of course, and that's why you had the attack near the U.S. consulate in Erbil on April 17th, and then you have attacks close to Iraq Kurdistan, whether it's in the Kirkuk front or which is also in northern Iraq, or the Mosul front. I do think that Baghdad and Erbil have to there's a lot in common that they can work on, and Baghdad can take steps to act as a big brother, because it is a big brother at the end of the day, and Erbil can also take some initiative and some steps to allow for all parties to get along. But at the end of the day, what is bringing Baghdad and Erbil together is the money. And of course, you do have to look at the regional picture as well. Iraq Kurdistan is closer to Turkey, and Turkey is very much invested in parts of Iraq Kurdistan, particularly Erbil and Duhok, and then the Iranian government is also influential. So when it comes to calculations about the future of Iraq Kurdistan, these countries will have a role as well.
I don't disagree with anything my friend said. Iraqi Kurdistan, is a fact, and it's a stable place. And so long as it continues to exploit, and I say that in a positive way, its status quo. It has this wonderful neither in nor out status that allows it to, to play, to hug Ankara on some issues against Baghdad, and hug Baghdad on some issues against Ankara, and occasionally hug Tehran against both of the above. It's in this really interesting, never the full responsibility of being its own government and having to kind of deal with the consequences of aligning with all these people. So being able to just kind of be a political party almost. So it's in a very good place. And I think as long as they continue to play smart politics, remain within, at least formally, the confines of Iraq, they're actually going to do extremely well. I mean, I'm on record saying I think the Kurds deserve better government than they've been getting. They've had two families now governing them for 20 or 30 years. It might be time to experiment outside that gene pool. But that aside, they've done very well. Now, the events of the last couple of years have brought to the fore the various tensions within the various Kurdish groups. We now, even a kind of casual observer is starting to observe that there are KDP Kurds and there are PUK Kurds and there are YPD Kurds. My favorite moments have been all these like U.S. former Marines and Rangers going to fight with this, the Syrian Kurds and figuring out after a week, these guys are communists, and then leaving in disgust. I told you that. PKK Kurds, we've been hearing about Iranian Kurds the last couple of weeks. So, Kurds are not the unified bloc that sometimes their propaganda would have you believe. They have their own interests, their own intramural squabbles. International borders matter, and what's important to the Kurds in Turkey is not necessarily as important to the Kurds in Iraq or the Kurds in Iran. But nonetheless, they've been good allies. They're clearly interested in the fight against ISIL. There's been, as we said, some radicalization of Kurds that probably are tens, hundreds, maybe even hitting the very, very low four figures numbers of Kurds inside ISIL. That's a problem that mostly the Kurds are going to have to deal with. And that's an issue for security in and around Erbil and Sulaymaniyah and other places. But for the most part, the Kurds have a pretty good thing going on. My only concern is their move into the disputed territories within Iraq and the possibility for long-term conflict in these disputed territories, disputed between Iraqi Sunni Arabs and Iraqi Kurds for the most part. That the kind of occupation by force of these areas by the Kurds, overriding any political process or any political concerns, and accusations of ethnic cleansing in support of that has set up a dynamic that could be very, very troubling.
I think I'm sorry, Rasha, before we launch the Syrian Kurds, I'm very interested to hear about them. What I always keep in mind, in addition to those regional countries, the United States will also have a big say in what happens in Iraq, Kurdistan. The U.S. is in a very good position actually to influence the relations between Baghdad and Erbil, and it can do a lot.
It's not as big a question for Syria as it is for Iraq, obviously, but I think, and as you know, the Syrian Kurds don't necessarily get along with Iraqi Kurds or even Turkish Kurds, and they're very fragmented, as you pointed out. I think many Kurds, and at some point, Syrian Kurds wanted to play a role in a post-Assad Syria and be part of the sort of the social fabric of a democratic Syria. As things stand now, I don't know. I think it just depends on which day of the week you ask. One day it's fighting ISIS, and sometimes the Kurds appear to side with the regime, and sometimes they appear to side against it, and they're just another player in the country's civil war at this point.
Well, I think we took a complex situation and made it even more complex. But I'd like to thank the panel for all of their insights. I have a couple more questions, but I'll open it up to the floor for now. And if there's a lull, maybe I'll ask another one of mine. So please, if you have a question, please raise your hand, identify yourself, please, and then let us know who you're addressing.
Sudani from Iraq. My question is that we could not build a very solid foundation to fight ISIL in all dimensions, whether operationally, strategically, or even in the media or the messaging. That's what we can say. We are offering ISIL a very negative messaging that they are getting benefit of that. And I think that my question is, what are these messages that we are sending to ISIL that they are getting advantages from? Thank you.
Go ahead.
Thanks. Yeah, I think there have been a series of messages, particularly out of Washington, that have been less than helpful. I'm a fan of the current Secretary of Defense. I'm on the record saying he was a great choice for the job. But you don't ever get up and say that a major ally of yours has an army with no will to fight, even if it's true, which I don't believe it to be in this particular case. I've defended this on the record before. I'm happy to talk about it if we need to. Even were it true, which I think it's not, it's still something you don't get up and do. You don't let ISIL have a propaganda message that the Iraqi army can't fight.
Right.
I mean, that's not helpful. So I could go down a further list of examples, but I think that one kind of exemplifies the trend that we're talking about. I think there are many actors in the U.S. political system who do not think about the impact that their message has in the region. It's conjured for a domestic audience, for a particular domestic purpose, and probably works very well for that. But we don't think about how it plays in the region, how it might harm our allies and assist ISIS.
Well, let me just first recognize General Soudani. He's the former defense attaché at the Iraqi embassy and one of the fine Iraqi generals, who served his country. And it's a very good question. I think my concern with the messaging is that number one, we did not, as the United States government, we did not get it right, and that has resulted in negatively impacting the morale of the Iraqi security forces. And we can avoid that. It's very simple. I would actually refer you, for those who are interested, the State Department last week, an unnamed senior official, had a wonderful briefing about what happened in Ramadi and the challenges that remain ahead. It was not completely rosy. It was not completely pessimistic either. It was right in the middle. And I think that's what we can do. It is a mistake to call out another ally. You can always have private channels to send your messages. But you do have to find that middle ground, and I think at the moment we do not have that middle ground. And my concern, of course, given that this is Washington, is you will have the politicization of Iraq. The more we get into the debate about what should we do in Iraq
And the elections.
And the elections, this is reminding me of 2006 Washington, when it was a very political issue, and as a result, it was not conducive to carry out, some good policies. So I think there's unity about what to do in Iraq in general, and Iraq should not be used in domestic U.S. politics.
We have a question over here.
Yes, I want to go back to.
If you could identify yourself.
Oh, yes, I'm Matt Spitalik. I'm a White House and foreign policy correspondent for Reuters. Welcome to our offices.
Thank you.
But going back to the Obama's strategy, you mentioned some very interesting ideas of how the U.S. could do better in terms of deployment of forces, something less than 10,000 troops, obviously, weapons deliveries, and I guess training comes into play, things of that sort. But I'm wondering if you could be. We've heard our administration, we've heard our defense secretary say that express doubt about the Iraqi forces' will to fight. What do you think about what's Obama's will to fight, to get into this fight in a way that it could actually sway it in some way? Do you think has he done enough? What more can he do? And more specifics there.
Yeah, I'm sure Doug will have a lot of thoughts on this because he has worked in the government as well, and he knows how it works from the inside. But what I do know is that it was not easy for President Obama to order the deployment of 3,000 U.S. soldiers into Iraq. Because keep in mind, there are 3,000 U.S. soldiers in Iraq at the moment, and President Obama did not want to do that. Iraq is not his war. So I do recognize that as I would say an intellectual and ideological sacrifice by the president to make this decision, and I see it as a positive development. And the deployment of the airstrikes is an important development as well. The issue is that the world and Iraqis in particular, and I would say even Syrians, I'm sure Russia would agree with this. They, no matter how much we do, it's not enough because the U.S. is a superpower. And throughout my trips, all of us who have went and met with Iraqis or Syrians or people in the Middle East, they think we're representatives of the U.S. government. So they eat our heads alive. in critique of the U.S. government, because no matter what we do is not enough, but we have to be realistic about what can be done and what cannot be done. And I think I'm not against deploying U.S. troops in general. I was a supporter of the 2003 war, and I still believe it was the right thing to do. But for this moment, strategic help deploy 5,000 to 10,000 soldiers into Iraq. We can do it. This high-profile footprint. It will take a lot of political capital to get it through, both in Iraq and in the United States. And we can use that political capital. The U.S. government can use that political capital for more other issues that can be worked on. So we can, and deploying U.S. troops can be done with smaller numbers and in a more effective way.
Are you talking about forward positions deployed to the front lines for advice or
it's
for
a possibility.
spotting?
It's a possibility. I don't believe. I generally do not believe that U.S. soldiers should put their lives on the line to give Iraq another chance. Period. But if it's done safely and as much as possible, I think it could be helpful. But as U.S. combat troops on the battlefield, it will. In the long term, and the Iraqis are capable of doing it, and they really have to do it.
The important thing to remember about additional U.S. troops in Iraq is, one, the United States has not offered to send them, and two, Iraq has not asked for them to come. And that second, I think, is a much underreported fact, and for a very simple reason. There are significant factions within the Iraqi polity who would see the return of even, I believe, U.S. forward air controllers or special forces out front with the troops as a first step towards the reoccupation of Iraq, and would see those as combatants. And these are people who are currently fighting against ISIS. So it would be very hard to, segregate. You know where ISIS is, more or less, and you can try to keep yourselves away from them. You can't keep yourselves away from the various, Soderist and not just, Muqtada al-Sadr, but the larger Soderist tradition of groups that would, in a very nationalist way, just see this as an occupying army. And at one level, I kind of respect that. I'd like to think, if someone sent an army to soldiers to occupy my country, I'd shoot them too. So I think that's much understated. So I think what the beauty of the strategy is, I think, at least the two of us seem to think this really is working in Iraq. And I keep telling I feel like the football coach who's saying this after, his team was just intercepted and, they ran a touchdown off it. But nonetheless, the strategy is working. Now, we may need to look at ways to increase the effect. The strategy is essentially train, equip, provide airstrikes, and provide intelligence. Well, we may need to look at improvements in all of those areas. Clearly there was a lack of anti-tank missiles at Ramadi. Why was there a lack of anti-tank missiles at Ramadi? Despite all their objections how they don't have equipment, the Kurds had plenty up in the north. They stopped all the car bombs that came at them because they had anti-tank missiles to shoot them. The Iraqi soldiers and Ramadi did not. So why were they not there? Did the Americans not know that they didn't have them? Was there a political decision not to supply them? Did the Iraqis say they didn't want them? I don't know what the answer to any of these questions is. All I know is the end result is there were no anti-tank missiles there where they needed them. And literally, we have pictures. Actually, ISIL provided us the pictures. Thank you very much. They had an armored bulldozer that very slowly, deliberately moved all the concrete barriers out of the way so that the car bombs could come through. And there was nothing the Iraqi soldiers could do to stop them. And that's why, you hear these numbers from the Pentagon, they were outnumbered 10-1. Well, they didn't have the right weapons, and they just had to watch as these car bombs came through, and 10-1 became 9-1, became 8-1, become 7-1 as these car bombs start blowing up. It doesn't take very long when you're getting, again, these Tim McVeigh-sized car bombs, and we have pictures of them. They're, dump trucks full of ammonium nitrate, the same stuff Tim McVeigh used, and we all know what that did to the Murrow building in Oklahoma City. So they had several sessions in Ramadi. They didn't have the right weapons. So that was a failure of the strategy. There wasn't the right equipment. Clearly, there wasn't the right intelligence, nor were the airstrikes on hand to make sure that these things didn't happen. So it's not that the strategy is wrong. It's that somehow that strategy was not properly executed in Ramadi. And everyone involved, you know, the U.S. military, the U.S. State Department, the coalition, all the various Iraqi agencies, I think, need to take a hard look at why the strategy did not work in this particular case. The strategy wasn't wrong. The execution had problems.
Adjustments in tactics, not overall
Exactly, that's exactly right. I mean, an
Almost
adjustment
nothing.
in the tactics of execution of the strategy, not the strategy itself.
Yeah, and I think, look, a lot of folks say, let's send, 10,000 U.S. soldiers and they will clear Anbar of ISIS. And that's 2 brigades. Do keep in mind that in 2006, 2007, there were 35,000 U.S. soldiers in Anbar. And you had the whole infrastructure of intelligence. I'm sure Doug might actually have worked on, some of those missions. You had the whole intelligence infrastructure that's non-existent at the moment, so you have to rebuild it. It will not be easy, even if you just send U.S. troops. It will take a long time to rebuild. And Anbar is not easy. The U.S. lost 4,491, soldiers in Iraq between 2003 to 2010. 1,335 were in Anbar. Second, that was what was the highest. So Anbar is not easy to clear. So it's not going to be the magic wand if we just sent 10,000 soldiers. It will be easier, but it's not going to be the magic wand.
We have a question in the back. Yes, sir.
Okay, Stanley Koger. Recently, Hassan Nasrallah gave a major speech. We are before unparalleled threat, he said. He sounds really worried. And then he said something else, which I thought was really insightful here to his thinking. There is no political solution in the foreseeable period, and it is left to attrition to the battle. Left to attrition. Now, attrition means not only the losses each side suffers, but their ability to replenish the losses. The UN Security Council just released a report. I'll just end with one sentence from the report. The rate of flow is higher than ever. This is the reinforcements of Islamic State, and is mainly focused on movement into the Syrian Arab Republic and Iraq, with a growing problem also evident in Libya. What I don't understand, how can Iraq replenish its losses? I can see how the Islamic State can replenish its losses. That's the UN Security Council report. How does Iraq replenish its losses?
Iraq is not taking casualties at a rate that significantly impact its ability to do demographic replacement. I mean, every loss it has is a tragedy, and the cemeteries in Najaf are busy, but it's nowhere near hitting a place where they demographically they can't replenish their forces. Even these weekends, I don't know exactly what the casualty rates are, but they're in the tens a day at worst, not hundreds, not thousands. That's a rate of loss they can absorb. I suspect that Nasrallah, Hezbollah proper, has few, if any, soldiers in Iraq. They're engaged in the Syrian theater. And where he's sitting, I just admitted I see no political solution for Syria in the near term. I'm not sure I terribly did, I hate to admit this in public, I'm not sure I really have a substantive disagreement with him that in the near term there's any type of political solution. And this is not going to be, from his perspective, a grinding of Hezbollah and Syrian regime forces against Nusra and ISIL.
I can see the headlines now.
I did put a caveat up front. Make sure y'all put that on.
But to follow up on your point, in Syria, it has become just that, a war of attrition, between, Hezbollah is feeling it to the bone because they have a finite number of fighters that they need at home, and they need
Right. Hezbollah has a demographic replacement problem, I think.
Yeah, very much.
The Iraqis do not. His does.
Very much. But Hezbollah in Syria is replenished or well supported by mercenaries that are brought, including from Iraq and from Afghanistan, that are fighting alongside the Assad regime and alongside Hezbollah, under the supervision of Iranian advisors. But certainly a major war of attrition is ongoing in Syria, I think, among all sides.
On that, I think there's also a lot of work that can be done on the ISIL side. I mean, we all know where they're coming from and through. They're coming largely from Saudi Arabia and Tunisia, and they're largely coming through Turkey and one particular pass in, in southwestern Turkey, coming into Syria. So there's a lot that can be done, I think, to interdict the flow of foreign fighters still, if we can get some allies to make that a higher priority.
Even from the time when they decide to leave their own country, which, Tunisia and Saudi Arabia can shape up on.
So earlier on, just a quick question for me. We were joking about different connections between this and other world events, but there is one world event that's coming up, and that's the deadline for Iran talks at the end of June. How do we see that affecting ISIS and the greater war against ISIS, if at all?
I think it's an excellent opportunity to engage Iran on every point that it wants accomplished and attach conditions for it to, engage in some sort of solution on Syria or, but I think it's a golden opportunity to engage Iran and really exploit it to the maximum.
As part of the P5+1 or in the immediate aftermath of P5+1?
As part of the talks.
I'm sure I agree.
I'm speechless.
I mean, clearly there's a major event that overshadows, it doesn't overshadow, but it throws a long shadow on the entire effort. Because Iran is, the major figure in the P5+1, and because of the response of the Gulf states and primarily the GCC, but other states as well, to the possibility of this happening. And given that these same states also happen to be the major backers of the two sides in the Syrian civil war, while you wouldn't think that nuclear talks and a mid-range insurgency and are connected, they clearly are, just because the protagonists are the same on each side. So these events are deeply intertwined, at least in the diplomatic and informational realms, in ways that you wouldn't suspect, I think.
Question? Yes.
Gabriel Sikowitz. What could we expect to see that could indicate ISIS is weakening? And then also, what could we expect from them if in fact they are weakening?
But I think you got to look at on the Iraq, I would say, even on the Syrian side. You do have to anticipate ISIS, probing campaigns into Baghdad or Damascus. It doesn't have to succeed. It should just stabilize, and that will be a good, good propaganda coup for ISIS if it's able to somehow demoralize the forces that it's fighting, through those operations. It will certainly be a big success, and I do take the regional, expansion seriously as well, but I'm not sure there's a lot that can be done about it. To be very blunt. But that, when you look at the whole, especially between Iraq and Syria, that's where ISIS is making its currency, essentially. Not the real currency, but the reputational currency, essentially. And that's where it will focus its effort and try to be successful. And I know, as we, one risk that we can run to, as an anti-ISIS coalition, is focus too much on Ramadi and forget that ISIS exists somewhere else in Iraq and in Syria, because that's always a possibility. So there has to be, I would say, continuous overwatch over northern Iraq, the Baghdad area, and in Syria, where in Raqqa, which is a provincial, ISIS capital there. This is what ISIS can do, and what we can do as well. But if ISIS loses terrain, that's clearly a sign of weakness. The difficulty with fighting ISIS, and that's why it's wrong to underestimate it, is that if you lose a neighborhood to ISIS, it's difficult to get that neighborhood back. I'm talking about a neighborhood, a number of blocks. That's the nature of the fight. So we do have to anticipate a long-term fight.
Yes.
Rami Gali. One issue that was lightly discussed earlier was the problem of the Arab youth bulge in the region of Iraq, for example. To me, that's the biggest concern because you have generation upon generation of vulnerable youths that could be taken, doesn't matter the name of the brand, whether it's ISIS, ISIL, Al-Qaeda in Iraq, doesn't matter. There's just this vulnerable pool the entire time. Do you guys think that the current U.S.-backed government in Iraq has the ability to push ISIS out or their influence or gain more stability in the region to avoid this problem of social instability?
I'll take this one. Iraq is probably one of the worst functioning democracies. That also puts it in like the top 10% of governments in the region. So I think we have to realize that they're part of the problem, part of this, environment, this morass that creates this environment in which, young people have to go look for meaning with these groups, is the lack of ability to participate socially, economically, politically. There are really only 3 places in the Arab world where you can do that, and that's Tunisia and Lebanon and Iraq. And again, none of these are anything to write home about. These are all extremely weak, fragile, immature, corrupt, I could keep going, democracies. But they're all democracies of a flavor. They are places where you can vote, where you can change representatives, where you can and have had peaceful transition of power. That's not nothing. So, is Iraq going to make it? Do they have the to do this? I don't know. I'm hopeful, but certainly they are light years ahead of the repressive regimes that permeate the region. And I guess this is why I get pretty passionate about defending the Iraqi state. To my mind, it remains kind of our last best hope for the region. If Iraq fails, then the only other model is, Bahrain, Qatar, Saudi Arabia. Is that really, and that's, to my mind, that's the problem, not the solution. So, no, I think that the Iraqi state, for all its problems, remains our best.
With regards to Arab youth, I think we live in a time when the war and the violence in the region is just it's so loud that it overlooks a lot of the really interesting and healthy dynamics that are going on among many youth throughout the region. I mean, there's and they're working quietly. They're trying to keep safe. A lot of them are in exile, certainly among Syrians, for example. But they are finding a place to exchange ideas and kind of dream up a future that they want to create. It might be too early for us to hear them or to see them, but it is going on. And when you travel through the region, you see them, and they're actually quite impressive. So there is hope for the youth in the Arab world.
We have a question here. Yes.
Yeah, thank you. I'm Molly from the Iraq Embassy. By the speakers, that ISIS really thrives on vacuums, political vacuums, security vacuums. And one of the main reasons why I think most of it failed was because there was such a politically toxic environment in Iraq for many, many years. And that led to dysfunction in the government and ultimately a security vacuum. I think since the formation of the new government in September, Iraq's political factions have realized that it's time to set aside their differences. They haven't necessarily forgotten their differences. I think they're fundamentally aside because they realize that only a united, strong Iraq can ultimately defeat ISIS. One of the problems I feel, almost a year after the fall of Mosul, is that external actors are, in an effort to vie for influence in Iraq, are pitting Iraq's political factions against each other. Some of them are seeking to aggregate Iraq's various ethnic political blocks. So my question really is, what do you think the United States can do to create a more constructive environment in the region as a whole.
Yeah. Well,
You're smarter than me, that's fine.
hardly.
Just like Suman.
Well, let's assume the United States isn't one of these toxic external powers, of which we're speaking. No, I think there's you make a very good fundamental point that we have in Iraq now a decent government that is better than its president. And that's all I ask for in this world. You know, there are things I don't like about the current Iraqi government. There are things I don't like about my own government. So, you know, we have something to work with in Iraq. In particular, I think we need to point to two individuals, to the Prime Minister, Haider al-Abadi, who's a technocrat and as Western-oriented as we could hope for the region. You know, an English speaker who spent much of his formational years in various places in England. And his counterpart, the Speaker of the Iraqi Parliament, which by tradition, not strictly constitution, is an Iraqi Sunni, an Arab Sunni, Ghauri. Both of these men are significantly more moderate than their predecessors in kind of the political space, if not necessarily the office. Haider al-Abadi certainly then al-Maliki, but Dr. Salim then say a figure like Tariq al-Hashimi, who I believe he was actually an assistant to at one point. That's not to say that, you know, the policies, and I totally agree with the question, the policies for these two men remain the same. It really has any different policy positions than Nouri al-Maliki had. The issue is that he's not as angry at everyone, and he's looking for the deal. He's looking to cut the deal. You know, and I think likewise with Dr. Salim al-Jabouri. Now, my concern, of course, is that both these men are relatively new to their office. Neither of them commands the power and influence that their predecessors had. Neither of them has the grassroots ties and therefore the popular legitimacy that their predecessors had. So I think if the United States could do anything, it would be to help support both these men as they move forward to try to, you know, help these two make the deals that need to be move forward.
So on that note, what role does foreign investment, for example, play in creating a more stable business environment and growing Iraq's economy beyond oil, for example?
I mean, this is what I do professionally, so I have some, you know, and I like to disclaim that. So I have some opinions and I have interests and I'm invested. You know, foreign investment is what Iraq needs to move forward. You know, with oil at 50% roughly of what it was last year, Iraq has a hard currency crisis and can't invest in the way that it would like to move things forward. That's, you know, there is no other word to describe doing business in Iraq than hard. It is really, really hard to do business in Iraq. There's a lot that the Iraqis could do to improve that, but some of it is just native to the place.
Right.
You know, some of it is just, you know, when you have, you know, Ottoman law with British law on top of it, with Ba'athist law on top of that, with CPA law on top of that, and then your latest laws on top of that, and, you know, 5 different legal codes all struggling it out, none of them having the same philosophical basis, so you can't really reconcile them. You know, it's a mess, and trying to get your action for investors set is difficult, really difficult. And even if you work through it, just getting a contract that holds up in all 5 of these legal codes that are built into the DNA of Iraqi law is just hard. So yeah, there's a significant role for international investment. I think most officials in Iraq are doing the best they can to encourage international investment. They're trying to find ways to provide the proper protections that international investors need. That said, it is deeply frustrating
That's all right. This question, I thank you.
But if you can make it work, the returns are great.
Yes.
Yes, that's very important. Let me just answer Ali's question. I thank you very much for your service at the embassy as well. The Iraq embassy is doing great work here in Washington, D.C. after a long time of not doing so. So it's you weren't here, right? So it's very refreshing, with the new ambassador, Ambassador Bailey and his team. So it's actually very good. And it's a very good question. I do think that when you look at the region, it's a if you divide it by pro anti-Iraq, the anti column will be longer than the pro column, and therefore many of those countries have good relations with the United States. Many of them are allies of the United States, and the U.S. can, especially when it comes to the anti-ISIS war, the U.S. can be more serious about pressuring them to change some of their policies. When we talked about the media earlier. You watch some of the channels based at satellite channels that everybody watches in the Middle East. They're very popular. A lot of them are based in the UAE or the Saudi channels, and just the rhetoric and the language from those channels is very toxic. And I think we can work on that front in addition to the political front. But as we well know. Just because the U.S. says or advises a country to do something, it doesn't mean the country is going to do it. That's an illusion that people outside of the U.S. have. We know better. The process does not work this way, but it does have to be part of the discussion always with other countries because Iraq, instability in Iraq, and this is one of the most used lines, but it's always accurate. Iraq is it for the whole region, as we see it in Syria and. As we might see in Saudi Arabia or Jordan, just from ISIS, not from other threats that those countries have to have.
I'm going to take one last question. So we're running out of time. Yes, please.
I'm Diane Perlman. I'm at the School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution at George Mason. I also have a chapter on psychology of terrorism. So basically the military, what we're talking about is going after the symptom and not the cause. And when we talk about the root causes and also some of your question, say simultaneously with dealing with that. There's just grievances, there's issues like trauma, humiliation, moral outrage. And also that ISIS has this, archetypal idea of this heroic father figure, the caliphate that's very appealing to people who are humiliated and alienated. So maybe in addition to dealing with grievances, tension reduction, and also deals with the compensation for humiliation, maybe like more positive, heroic. You have to have another energy that has a stronger attraction than that in a positive way to attract people away from that and the whole Shiite thing, and a body is an attempt to deal with some of those issues. So what about, aside from just the military aspect of dealing with the underlying conflict, what the parties want, working on strategies for that?
Professor, it's a good question. It's way above my pay grade, so I won't be able to answer. So I don't know.
I don't know. We need another hero, basically. Yeah, we definitely need a hero. Listen, suffers from one main thing, and that's the lack of a vision and the lack of, idea of who we are and who we want to be in the future, and why did we go to the street and revolt? What did we want? People in the Arab world know what they don't want very often, but no one can tell you what they want. And ask. I know in Syria, ask 10 Syrians, what do you envision new Syria to look like, and they'll give you 20 different answers. There's no common ground. There's no sense of common identity. Pan-Arabism is dead, long dead. So what's Pan-Islamism is rising. ISIS is sort of a form of uber Sunni nationalism.
There's also a gender and patriarchal component to that, which makes it harder.
Yeah, but yeah, everybody's looking. We all need another hero.
Well, maybe we'll host the next event on a vision.
I think the issue, of course, is that I think you're absolutely right that humiliation is the term. The problem is these humiliations go multiple directions, and they often involve the same people on different sides. You know, right now, I think it's safe to say that there are portions of Iraq's Arab Sunni population that feel humiliated by the fact that the Ba'ath Party is repressed, and are very vocal about the fact that they want de-Baathification lifted. Meanwhile, the Kurds are trying to get the Ba'ath labeled as genocidaires for what they did to them in Halabja in the 90s. So how do you reconcile these two visions when what will remove humiliation for one group will increase it for the other? And I don't have good answers for you, unfortunately, right now. And this is kind of the thing I always end my Iraq talks on. You know, the issue is, you know, the things that hold Iraq together are all coldly logical. You know, Iraq needs to stay together to stand up to its neighbors. The oil distribution system only works if Iraq hangs together. Any logical analysis tells you Iraq has to stay together. Everything pulling Iraq apart is emotion and passion. But we all know that emotion and passion are very, very powerful forces in this world. So.
Well, I think that's a good place to end. I'd like to thank you all for joining us, and I'd like to also thank the Project for the Study of the 21st Century and its director, Mr. Peter Apps, who is in London, but with us in spirit. And if you've enjoyed the analysis that we provided here, I'd like to direct you to Carrie, who's the editor of the PS21 Mideast blog, where I'm sure you'll be reading lots and lots of good analysis in the coming weeks. I'd like to thank our panel, Doug and Ahmed and Rasha, and again, I'm Milena Rodban, and very grateful to you all for joining us. And if you have any additional questions, I hope you'll reach out to us on Twitter. Thank you.